One thing that people in the media generally don't like to admit is that they themselves play an outsized role in shaping perceptions of which candidates are up and down and in between in the context of especially a primary race when earlier on in the process, not a huge amount of voters are tuned in. So at the very beginning of this process, for 2020 in January, when Kamala Harris declared her presidential campaign, you had a lot of people with prominent media perches automatically declaring that she was something like the front runner, or she was obviously the strongest candidate, or she had all these glorious intangible assets that made it very likely that she was going to win the nomination. Now, was that just dispassionate analysis on their part, where they were looking out at the objective circumstances and decreeing without any self-interest that Kamala was this wonderkind? No. They were projecting their own preferences onto her. And why do a lot of the people in the media have a preference for somebody like Harris? Well, she is seen as somebody who is a better demographic representation of the Democratic Party coalition than some other candidates may be. That has to do with her racial and gender characteristics, obviously, but she's also sort of rhetorically in line with the sensibilities of the media class, meaning that she's very staunchly anti-Trump in her rhetoric, but anti-Trump from a standpoint of sort of superficial liberal reaction, rather than anything that really is putting forth a substantive or a structural critique of the factors which gave rise to Trump assuming power in the first place. And so they pronounced with much certitude when Kamala announced her campaign in January that she was obviously the strongest candidate. Nate Silver, the data genius, said on January 29th, quote, "She's probably the front runner at this point, folks. Sorry, folks, pack it in. Ball game over. Kamala is going to take this thing." And, of course, Nate would strenuously deny that that was ever a reflection of his own personal views. I've actually challenged him at times to just be transparent about his personal views and state what his preferences are, but, of course, he refuses. And so that narrative began to take hold. 538, also around that time, put out this convoluted graphic which made zero sense that was supposed to demonstrate how Kamala Harris had the broadest possible coalition that could usher her to the nomination. And one of the reasons why that coalition was so strong, according to this bizarre and ridiculous infographic, was that she had the most potential among black voters. Newsflash, 9 months later, Joe Biden is still way, way, way ahead with black voters by every metric virtually, and he's got a seemingly impenetrable lead in South Carolina, which has a majority black electorate for the Democratic primary. That number hasn't budged almost at all. And so you have to wonder why they were so confident in proclaiming that Kamala Harris was automatically the most formidable candidate because she had these inroads with black voters. It seems pretty condescending to think that just because this black woman from California, Berkeley in particular, has certain racial characteristics, that automatically that's going to transfer into appeal among black voters. I mean, I think black voters can generally make their own decisions about that kind of stuff, and it doesn't always have strictly to do with the racial characteristics of the candidate. Biden's an old white guy, and yeah, a lot of the reason why they support him is because of his relationship with Obama, but nonetheless, he's an old white guy, right? And Kamala Harris is behind other white individuals, such as Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, among black voters. In fact, Kamala Harris now has the distinction of undergoing the most spectacular collapse, polling-wise, of any candidate thus far in the 2020 cycle. If you compare the high that she reached, it was really a sugar high after the first debate in June when she infamously or famously attacked Biden on somewhat spurious grounds. And then look at it now where she's down big time. And not only is she down, there are now polls coming out from California, her home state, where she's behind, drum roll please, Yang. Imagine that. So that's why I was always very skeptical of the narrative which was placing her at the top of the field. And I was basically insistent, again, from the beginning, go look at some of my tweets. I'll pull a couple up, where I was saying that this narrative was just a reflection of what the pundit class wanted to happen. They were wish casting. So they weren't just forecasting objectively. They were projecting their own wishes and desires onto the race. And Kamala Harris was their ideal vehicle for who would represent the anti-Trump resistance or whatever in this current moment. So what's the lesson there ultimately? Don't believe the hype about a candidate unless that candidate can demonstrate something beyond flattery of media elites. Because, like it or not, media elites do have a big role in this process. They dictate who gets what level of coverage. They dictate whether the coverage is positive or negative. It isn't hard to discern what their preferences are. And if that means promoting a certain candidate because of whatever political or social reasons are operative for them, they will do so. And Nate Silver would be a perfect example of that. He routinely had Kamala Harris in the top tier of candidates all throughout this year, and now she's sinking into the mid-single digits, which puts her basically on the same quote-unquote tier as Beto and Yang and people who might have some following but not anywhere near enough, at least at this juncture, to win the nomination. So that tells you all you need to know about Natey Boy, and we'll see if he actually admits any analytical failure on this subject. I tend to doubt it. This is the same guy, meaning Nate, who had frequently put Bernie and Mayor Pete on the same tier through this year. Even if you hate Bernie, right? The idea that he had comparable strength in the electorate to Mayor Pete never made any sense. Again, that was just Nate reacting to hype and trying to frame his analysis in strictly empirical terms when, at bottom, what he's basically doing is just regurgitating conventional wisdom but giving it a data sheen. And that's a common pattern for Nate. I've said often that I think he does decent analysis when you get strictly into the methodological questions around polling, but when he puts on his pundit hat, he is just as painfully fallible as anybody. So that's it. Talk to you later.